My landlord put a clause in my lease that let him enter my apartment whenever he wanted. He always came when I was in the shower. I moved into my apartment when I was 23 because it was the only place I could afford that wasn't falling apart. It was a one-bedroom on the second floor of a small building with 6 units. The rent was reasonable, the neighborhood was safe, and the place was clean. The landlord's name was Vin. He lived in the unit directly below mine and managed the building himself. When I signed the lease, I read through the whole thing because my mom always told me to read everything before signing. Most of it was standard. Security deposit, noise rules, pet policy, move-out procedures. Then there was a clause on page 4 that said the landlord reserves the right to enter any unit for routine inspections at any time without prior notice. I asked Vin about it. He said it was just a formality and that he only used it if there was a maintenance issue or a suspected leak. He said he barely ever came upstairs and that most tenants didn't even know the clause was there. I believed him because he seemed normal. He was in his 50s, quiet, kept the hallways clean, and always said good morning when I passed him in the lobby. I signed the lease. For the first 2 months, everything was fine. Vin fixed a drip in my kitchen faucet the first week and was in and out in 10 minutes. He left a note under my door when the water was going to be shut off for an hour one Saturday. Normal landlord stuff. Then the visit started. The first time it happened, I was in the shower on a Tuesday morning before work. I heard my front door open and close. I froze. I turned off the water and listened and heard footsteps in my apartment. I grabbed a towel and cracked the bathroom door and Vin was standing in my hallway. He said he was checking the smoke detectors. I was standing there dripping wet in a towel and he looked at me for a second too long before he said everything looks fine and walked out. I stood there with my heart pounding and told myself it was just bad timing. The following Tuesday, I was in the shower again at the same time because that's my routine before work, and I heard the door again. Same thing. Footsteps. I called out and said who's there. Vin said it's just me, checking on that pipe in the wall. I said what pipe? He said there might be a slow leak behind the bathroom wall. I was in the shower. He was standing outside my bathroom door talking to me while I was naked behind a curtain. He left after a minute. I got out and checked the wall. There was nothing wrong with it. On the third Tuesday, it happened again. This time I was mid-shampoo and I heard the lock turn and the door open, and I heard him walk through the apartment slowly. He didn't call out. He didn't announce himself. He walked through my living room, past the kitchen, and stopped in the hallway right outside the bathroom. I could see his shadow under the door. He stood there for about 30 seconds and then knocked and said just doing a quick check. I said I'm in the shower, Vin. He said sorry, won't be long. He stood there for another moment and then I heard him walk away and the front door closed. I sat on the edge of the tub with conditioner still in my hair and I felt sick. This man was coming into my apartment every single Tuesday at the same time because he knew I would be in the shower. He had access to my routine because he lived directly below me and could hear my pipes turn on every morning. He knew when the water started. He knew when I was in there, and he used that clause in the lease to walk into my home whenever he wanted. I called my mother that night and told her everything. She told me to get out. I said I couldn't afford to break. She said then, you need to make it stop. I started locking the deadbolt from inside. Next Tuesday, Vin tried the door. He knocked, said he'd do inspect. I said the door, that I was busy and he could come back later. He said the lease allowed his arrest and unfit to allow actions was threatened to building. I asked him if Vin had ever entered his apartment without notice. He said no, never. Not once in 6 years. He said Vin always texted him at least a day in advance if he needed to come in for anything. I asked if his lease had the same clause. He said he didn't remember. He pulled his lease out of a filing cabinet and we checked page by page. His lease didn't have that clause. The entry section of his lease said the landlord will provide 24 hours written notice before entering a unit, except in the case of emergency. Standard, legal, the exact opposite of what mine said. I thanked Dennis and went to the next door. The second door was Unit 3, directly across the hall from mine. A woman named Josette. She was in her 30s and had been there about a year longer than me. I asked her the same thing. Her face changed immediately. Not surprise, recognition. Like she had been carrying something heavy and someone just pointed at it and said, I see it too. She said yes. She said Vin had come into her apartment 4 times in her first 6 months, always when she was home alone, always in the morning. She said the first time he said he needed to check the radiator. The second time he said he smelled gas and needed to check the stove. The third time he didn't give a reason at all. He just walked in and stood in her kitchen looking around. She said each time she was in some state of undress because he always came during the window when she was getting ready for work. She said the last time he came in, she was changing in her bedroom with the door open, and he walked in without knocking and stood in her hallway and called out, hello, is anyone home, while she scrambled to put on a shirt. She said she saw him through the gap in the bedroom door, and he was standing perfectly still with his head tilted slightly like he was listening. She said she stopped leaving her bedroom door open after that. She said she started getting dressed in the bathroom with the door locked even though she lived alone. She said she thought it was just her and she felt stupid bringing it up because the lease said he could do it. I told her it wasn't just her and that the same thing was happening to me. She started shaking, not crying, shaking. The quiet kind that comes from realizing the thing you told yourself to ignore was real all along and someone else just confirmed it. The third door was Unit 5 on the 3rd floor. A younger woman named Blythe who had moved in 3 months before me. She didn't have the clause in her lease either. She said Vin had never entered her unit unannounced. She said he'd been nothing but professional. I went back to my apartment and sat at my kitchen table with the eviction threat note and Josette's story and the fact that only some leases had the clause, and the apartments that had it were the ones occupied by women who lived alone. Dennis didn't have the clause. He was a man. He'd been there 6 years. Vin texted him 24 hours before every visit. Blythe didn't have the clause. She was young, but she had a boyfriend who stayed over most nights. Vin had seen him in the hallway. He knew Blythe wasn't alone. Josette and I both had the clause. We were both women. We both lived alone. We both had morning routines that involved being undressed at predictable times. Units 4 and 6 didn't answer, but I already knew enough. enough. This wasn't random. This wasn't carelessness. This wasn't a landlord who forgot to update his lease template. Vin wasn't doing routine inspections. He was selecting tenants. He was putting that clause in specific leases, the ones signed by women who lived alone, and then using it as a legal excuse to walk into their homes whenever he wanted. The clause wasn't a formality. It was a tool. And the pattern with Tuesday mornings wasn't coincidence. He lived directly below me. He could hear the pipes. He knew my schedule to the minute, and he timed his entries to the moment I was most vulnerable and least able to confront him. I called my mom and told her what I'd found. She said, call a lawyer tomorrow morning. I said, I'm calling one tonight. I found a tenant rights attorney named Daria Colvin through a legal aid referral line. I called her office the next day at 8 a.m. when they opened. The receptionist said the earliest available appointment was in 2 weeks. I said I have a landlord who enters my apartment while I'm in the shower, and he's threatening to evict me for locking my door. She put me through to Daria directly. I was in her office by Thursday. I brought my lease, Vin's eviction threat note, and a written timeline of every time he entered my apartment, including the day, time, what he said, how long he stayed, and what I was doing at the time of entry. I had documented everything because my mother taught me that too. Write it down. Everything. Always. She said that was the best thing I ever did for myself because without that timeline, it would have been my word against his. With it, it was a pattern on paper. Daria read the lease and looked up at me and said this clause is unenforceable. She said in our state, landlords are required by law to provide at least 24 hours written notice before entering a tenant's unit, except in the case of a genuine emergency like a fire or a burst pipe. She said the clause in my lease directly contradicted state law and was void regardless of whether I signed it. She said Vin knew that. She said any landlord who manages his own building and writes his own leases knows the entry notice laws. He put that clause in deliberately because he was counting on tenants not knowing their rights. She said the repeated entries during my shower were a pattern of harassment. She said the eviction threat note for locking my door was retaliation. She said both of those together, combined with the fact that the clause only appeared in leases of specific tenants, painted a very clear picture. I told her about Josette. She asked if Josette would be willing to talk. I said I'd ask. I went home that evening and knocked on Josette's door. I told her what the lawyer said. I told her the clause was illegal. I told her Vin had no right to enter her apartment without 24 hours notice, and that every time he walked in unannounced, he was breaking the law. I told her a lease clause doesn't override state law any more than writing I'm allowed to steal on a napkin makes theft legal. Josette stared at me and then said he told me it was in the lease, and I just accepted it. She said I felt like something was wrong every single time he came in. She said her stomach would drop the second she heard the door. She said she changed her morning routine 3 times trying to avoid him, and he always seemed to know when she'd adjusted. She said she thought she was being paranoid and she felt stupid bringing it up because the paper said he could do it. I told her she wasn't overreacting. I told her she wasn't paranoid. I told her the paper was a lie designed to make her believe she had no power. She sat down on her couch and was quiet for a long time. Then she said, what do we do? I said we do everything. The next week, Daria sent Vin a letter. It was certified mail, delivered to his unit. The letter informed him that the entry clause in my lease was unenforceable under state law. It demanded that he cease all unannounced entries immediately. It stated that any further attempts to enter my unit without 24 hours written notice would be reported to law enforcement as trespassing. It stated that the eviction threat constituted illegal retaliation, and that if he pursued it, we would file a counterclaim. And it informed him that we were aware the clause had been selectively included in leases of specific tenants, and that this pattern was being documented. Vin didn't respond to the letter. Not to Daria, not to me. No note under my door, no knock, no morning visit, complete silence. For 2 weeks he acted like I didn't exist. He stopped saying good morning in the lobby. He stopped making eye contact. When I passed him in the hallway, he looked at the floor and kept walking. I knew the silence wasn't guilt. It was calculation. He was figuring out his next move. His next move came on a Wednesday. I got home from work and found a notice taped to my door. It said my lease would not be renewed when it expired in 60 days, and that I was expected to vacate by the end date. He wasn't trying to evict me anymore. He was just not renewing. Daria said this was predictable. She said landlords who get caught doing what Vin was doing almost always try to remove the tenant quietly, rather than face a legal battle. She said we had 2 options. Option 1, I could accept the non-renewal, move out, and be done with him. Option 2, I could file a complaint with the housing authority and pursue a harassment claim while simultaneously fighting the non-renewal as retaliatory. I chose option 2. Josette chose option 2 with me. Daria filed the complaint on a Tuesday. She included both of our timelines, copies of both leases showing the clause, copies of the leases from Dennis and Blythe that did not have the clause, the eviction threat note, and the non-renewal notice. The housing authority investigator assigned to our case was a woman named Faye. She came to the building on a Friday morning and interviewed all 6 tenants individually. She spent about 20 minutes with each person. She pulled lease records. She checked whether Vin had filed the required inspection documentation with the city for any of his entries. He hadn't, not a single one. In our state, even legitimate inspections require a filed report with the housing authority within 30 days. There was no record of any maintenance issue, suspected leak, or smoke detector problem that would have justified entering my unit on any of the dates I documented. There was no record of the supposed pipe behind my bathroom wall. There was no work order, no contractor receipt, no evidence that any repair was ever needed, planned, or completed. Every reason Vin gave me for entering my apartment was made up on the spot. He wasn't inspecting anything. He was creating a reason to be in my home at the exact moment I couldn't stop him. Faye's report was completed 3 weeks later. The findings were that Vin had violated state entry notification laws on multiple occasions across multiple, that the lease clause was off and appeared selective. Tenants living alone, that the non-renewal of my lease was retaliatory in response to my assertion of legal rights, and that the pattern of entries timed to coincide with tenants being in the shower constituted a pattern of harassment. The housing authority issued Vin a formal citation. He was fined $4,500 across multiple violations. He was ordered to remove the clause from all current and future leases immediately. He was required to complete a state-certified landlord certification course on tenant rights and entry laws within 90 days. He was placed on a monitoring list for the next 3 years, meaning any future complaints would trigger an automatic investigation, and the non-renewal of my lease was voided as retaliatory. I wasn't going anywhere. Josette's lease was also corrected, and her entry clause was struck. She stayed too. The day the ruling came through, Josette knocked on my door and said, "Thank you for knocking on mine." I said, "Thank you for opening it." After the citation, Van put the building up for sale. He didn't fight. He didn't appeal. He didn't come to my door to explain himself or plead his case. He listed it within 2 weeks of the ruling, and I never saw him again after the for sale sign went up in the lobby. He moved out before the building even sold. He was there one day and gone the next. Like the whole building was a stage set he could just walk away from. I think about that sometimes. How easy it was for him to leave. How easy it was for him to decide that losing the building was less trouble than facing what he'd done in it. He never apologized. Not to me. Not to Josette. Not to anyone. He just left. I think he expected us to be quiet. I think he expected the same thing every person like him expects. That the people they target will be too afraid or too confused or too unsure of themselves to push back. He counted on the lease making us feel like we had no standing. He counted on us thinking that because we signed something, we had agreed to be uncomfortable in our own homes. He counted on the fact that most 23-year-olds don't know tenant law, and most women who live alone are taught to question their instincts before they question the man making them uncomfortable. He was almost right. If I hadn't locked that deadbolt on a Tuesday morning, he might have kept coming every week for the rest of my lease. If he hadn't slid that note under my door threatening to evict me for protecting myself, I might never have knocked on those doors. And if Josette hadn't told me her story through shaking hands, I might have believed I was alone. The building sold 2 months later to a property management company. They sent a rep to introduce themselves. Normal people, normal policies. 24 hours notice for inspections, in writing every time. The new management replaced the locks on every unit. I asked them to, and they did it the same week without hesitation. The maintenance guy who installed mine was named Carlos, and he showed me how the new deadbolt worked and handed me 3 keys and said, "Let me know if you need anything else." I said, "This is perfect." I stood in my apartment the evening they changed the lock and held the new key in my hand, and I can't explain what that felt like. It was just a key, a small brass key on a plain ring, but it meant that no one was walking into my home without my permission ever again. No clause, no formality, no quiet footsteps in the hallway while I'm standing in my own shower trying to wash my hair. Just a lock that worked the way a lock is supposed to work, keeping people out until I decide to let them in. I still live there. Josette still lives across the hall. We check on each other, not in a dramatic way, just a knock and a, "Hey, everything okay in there?" and a, "Yeah, all good, thanks." It's small, but when you've lived in a building where someone used a piece of paper to make you feel like your own home wasn't yours, a knock from a neighbor who understands what that felt like is worth more than most people realize. My mom came to visit last month. She sat on my couch and looked around and said it's a nice place. I said it is now. She asked if I was happy there. I said I was comfortable. She said good. Comfortable is underrated. People chase happiness and excitement and passion. Nobody talks about the simple power of being comfortable in your own home, of standing barefoot in your kitchen at 6 in the morning, knowing that the door behind you is locked and will stay locked until you decide otherwise. That's not a small thing. That's everything. She was right. For a long time, I didn't feel comfortable in my own apartment. I showered with the bathroom door locked and a chair wedged under the front door handle. I flinched every time I heard footsteps in the hallway. I kept my phone on the bathroom sink every morning in case I needed to call someone. That's what Vin took from me. Not safety in the traditional sense. He never touched me. He never said anything explicitly threatening. He just made me feel like my home had a hole in it that he could walk through whenever he wanted. And that feeling, the feeling that you are not alone when you should be, that someone is on the other side of a door you can't fully lock, that your most private moments are being timed by the man downstairs, that stays with you longer than you'd think. I don't feel that anymore. The new lock works. The chair stays in the closet. I shower with the bathroom door open some mornings because I can. Not every morning, but some. And each time I do, it feels like taking something back that I shouldn't have had to lose in the first place. That's the thing about what Vin did. It wasn't violent. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet and scheduled and legal sounding, and it happened every Tuesday at 7:15 a.m. in a clean building with a polite landlord who always said good morning. And if I hadn't read my lease, and if my mother hadn't taught me to write everything down, and if I hadn't knocked on those doors, he'd still be doing it. To me, to Josette, to whoever moved into the next empty unit and signed a lease with a clause on page 4 that looked like a formality and wasn't.